Good afternoon. Bon après-midi tout le monde. As we've seen over the past weeks, wildfire season in Canada begins earlier and it accelerates more quickly than we've historically been used to. Wildfires are a real danger to communities across the country, and as we speak today, there are thousands of Canadians displaced from their homes due to fires. I want to take a moment to firstly acknowledge Sue and Richard Knoll, who unfortunately passed away after being trapped in a wildfire. I want to extend my deepest condolences to their families and friends. Wildfires, unfortunately, are becoming a part of our reality across the country. But the first step to combating a problem is to understand it, and today I'll be briefly talking about the wildfire season for 2025, informed by the best information that we have available. Les feux de forêt font malheureusement partie de notre réalité à travers tous les pays. Mais la première étape pour lutter contre un problème est de le comprendre. Aujourd'hui, nous allons vous présenter les prévisions pour la saison de feux de forêt 2025 basées sur les dernières informations disponibles. I'm joined today by my cabinet colleagues, Minister Hodgson, Minister Dabrusin, and Minister Gull-Masty, and they'll be sharing remarks. And I want to thank them in advance for their and their department's assistance in managing wildfires across the country. I want to say, too, that my heart is with the communities, families, and individuals affected by these wildfires. And please know that Canadians across the country are standing with you. I know you're scared, and you're facing fear, and you're facing uncertainty. And I want to assure you that our government will continue to do everything that we can to help. I want to speak directly to first responders. Your courage and your dedication do not go unnoticed. Every single time you put yourself in harm's way to protect others, you remind us what public service truly means. We are deeply grateful for everything that you do. So I'll now take just a brief opportunity to provide you with an overview about the current situation across the country. As of today, the National Wildlife Preparedness is at level 5, and that means firefighters and equipment in every jurisdiction across the country are in use. There are 225 active fires across Canada, including 121 of which are out of control. 241 international firefighters have been mobilized in Canada, and all 5 of our humanitarian workforce NGOs have been activated. Every wildfire, I want to reassure Canadians, is being responded to as appropriate, primarily by local and provincial authorities. These partners are the ones on the front lines, and their leadership is absolutely essential. They know their communities, and they know the needs of their communities best. Our role at the federal level is to support their efforts when asked and to move quickly when these calls come in. I'm in close contact with my provincial and territorial counterparts and have shared this wildfire forecast with each of them as well. We'll be meeting soon to ensure that we continue to cooperatively respond to wildfires in the best way possible across the country. And rest assured that the federal government will always be there to respond and to assist if our help is requested. And that's exactly what we did on the night of May 28th. So late in the evening, we received 2 urgent requests from the Government of Manitoba for assistance in air evacuations from Cross Lake and Matthias-Colum Cree Nation. Within hours, our officials were coordinating the response. The Government Operations Centre worked closely with the Canadian Armed Forces, the Coast Guard, Public Health Agency of Canada, Indigenous Services Canada, and other federal and provincial partners to get help where it was needed. I'm pleased to report, and I know you know this, that those evacuations were successful. They were completed by June 3rd with no loss to life or limb, thanks to the swift action of first responders, the Canadian Armed Forces, and everyone else involved in that evacuation effort. More recently, we approved a request for federal assistance for the community of Sandy Lake First Nation in Ontario. That was on June 7th, and as of today, I've been advised that that evacuation is complete. And again, I want to thank everyone who worked around the clock to get people to safety. The cities of Kapuskasing, Cornwall, Mississauga, and Thunder Bay are serving as host communities for those evacuees. And thank you so much to the good people of those communities. You know, it's true that Canadians always step up in times of crisis, and this year is no exception. It is really amazing to see local and First Nation communities come together and help one another out in these very difficult times. In addition, last week on June 4th, I announced that the Government of Canada, along with Manitoba and Saskatchewan, will match all individual donations made to the Red Cross with respect to the wildlife appeals in those provinces. And that means every dollar given will go even further to support individuals and communities affected by wildfires. I mentioned that the federal government's humanitarian workforce, which includes NGOs, are activated across the provinces affected by wildfires, and they're doing a tremendous amount of work on the ground. I think it's important to name them and highlight the efforts that they're making to help citizens and evacuees during these trying times. So thank you very much to Team Rubicon, St. John Ambulance, the Canadian Red Cross, the Salvation Army, and Search and Rescue Volunteer Association of Canada. I also want to thank our Vancouver and Calgary heavy urban search and rescue teams because they also provided support in Manitoba and in Alberta. So while we remain focused on immediate threats, we're also looking ahead. The wildfire risk remains high in Western and Central Canada due to ongoing drought conditions and above normal temperatures. But I want Canadian communities to know this. We are monitoring the situation closely, and we are ready to act swiftly if more help is needed. And of course, response is only part of the story. In the weeks and months ahead, lots of communities will need to begin the process of rebuilding and recovery, and we will be there for that too. Through the disaster financial assistance arrangements, the federal government can help provinces and territories cover the needs for large-scale recovery efforts. We have modernized how this support's delivered, so we're placing climate resilience at the heart of disaster recovery. Recovery isn't enough either. We also need to be better prepared before disaster strikes, and that's why we're taking a fresh look at how Canada can strengthen its emergency resilience, and that means improving coordination, ensuring resources go to the right place when they're needed, and supporting long-term planning to help communities adapt to what is an ever-changing climate. We can't prevent every wildfire, but we can and must be ready to respond swiftly, effectively, and in full partnership with those who are on the front lines. That's a priority for our new government, one that the Prime Minister underscored by naming me Canada's first ever Minister for Community Resilience. And those words are important, and it means that we'll be leading efforts to help communities build up their capacity and the infrastructure they need to withstand and recover from climate-driven emergencies, not just this season, but in the years to come. This is a difficult time, and that's when Canadians show their true strength. From volunteers pitching in at shelters to provinces and territories stepping up to help one another, our strength lies in our unity of purpose and in our solidarity. C'est une période difficile, mais c'est aussi dans ce moment-là qu'on voit la vraie force des Canadiens. Des bénévoles qui donnent un coup de main dans les refuges en passant par les provinces et les territoires qui s'entraident. Notre force, c'est notre solidarité. And Canadians should know this. Your federal government will always be there when needed. Thank you, merci.
Bonjour tout le monde. Good morning, good afternoon to everyone in Canada. As we just heard, many communities across Canada are currently facing devastating wildfire conditions. First, let me start by also offering my deepest condolences to the family and community members of the two Lac de Bonnie, Manitoba residents who lost their lives in the wildfire. As someone with strong roots in the prairies, my thoughts are with Manitobans and with the people of Saskatchewan who are dealing with the dire situation at the moment. And as someone who is proud to live in Ontario now, my thoughts are also with the members of the Sandy Lake First Nation who have been evacuated from their homes this week. While the evacuations have been completed successfully, and in Saskatchewan, Premier Moe has confirmed that around 7,000 people in the region around Lac La Ronge will be allowed to return home starting today, it is very clear that this wildfire season is off to a very challenging start. More than 3.7 million hectares have been burned, and wildfire smoke is affecting air quality across the country. As we speak, firefighters, first responders, Canadian Armed Forces members, and volunteers are bravely serving Canadians, working tirelessly, often at great personal risk, to protect lives and property. That includes firefighters from the United States and Australia. To those that have come from far away to stand with Canadians and protect our communities, thank you. If a time comes where you need our support in return, we will be there. On behalf of all Canadians, I'd like to offer every person involved in these terrible situations my sincerest thanks for their selflessness and courage. I stand before you as not only a minister, but also as a fellow Canadian concerned deeply for our forests, our communities, and our shared future. As someone with a background in business, not politics, I'm also concerned about the fiscal impacts of wildfires. 2024 was the costliest year in Canadian history for severe weather-related losses, including the wildfires in Jasper, with insured damages exceeding $8.5 billion. By 2040, NRCan estimates the fire suppression costs alone could double as Canada continues to keep up with both worsening wildfire risks and the increasing severity and frequency of wildfires. It's important we arm ourselves with the best information and resources in order to efficiently and forcefully face this year's wildfire season, as well as those to come. The outlook in the 2025 wildfire season indicates that wildfire risk across most of Western and Northern Canada is expected to be elevated over the coming months. While increased rainfall in the latter half of June could reduce the risk of new fires igniting, high fire risk conditions are expected to return in July and likely persist through August, as Canada is forecast to experience drought-like conditions and above normal temperatures. As Canada's new Minister of Energy and Natural Resources, I'm committed to taking action in collaboration with my colleagues here and provincial and territorial partners to help Canadians to prevent, to respond, and to recover from these devastating events, wherever and whenever they happen. Over the course of the previous government's tenure, they announced over $800 million to support wildfire resilience across the country. And our support continues, especially given the impacts of the 2025 wildfires already on homes and communities. On that note, I'm proud to announce a federal, territorial, provincial investment of approximately $104 million through the Fire Smart program. This represents over $94 million in joint investments from the governments of Canada, British Columbia, Alberta, Newfoundland and Labrador, Manitoba, the Yukon, Nova Scotia, and Prince Edward Island, as well as over $9 million provided by the Canadian Interagency Forest Fire Centre called CIFC. FireSmart is key to our national wildfire prevention and mitigation efforts. The program identifies and reduces wildfire risk and provides actionable guidance for homeowners and communities. These investments will increase wildfire preparations and resilience across the country, helping to prevent wildfires and mitigate their impacts at the individual and community levels, including Indigenous and other remote communities which are disproportionately threatened by wildfires. We will continue to make meaningful investments in gathering better data, equipment, and training. Our forests are at the heart of our way of life. They sustain biodiversity, support industries and livelihoods, store carbon, filter water, and hold deep cultural meaning for Indigenous communities. Canadians rightly expect us to protect this shared resource. That means constantly improving how we prepare for and respond to wildfires through smart investments, stronger science, and coordinated action. This is not the work of one government or one sector. It is a shared responsibility. So let's continue building momentum across all levels of government in conjunction with Indigenous leadership, industry, experts, and communities, and all Canadians. Let me leave you with this. Canadians elected us not to govern, but to protect. Not just to govern, but to protect. To be the shield when we face uncertainty and to a force that drives progress when challenges arise. Whether it's standing up to unjust tariffs that threaten our workers or confronting the wildfires that endanger our homes and landscapes, we are here with a steady hand and a clear purpose. We will meet these moments not with fear, but with resolve. Because protecting Canada means more than reacting, it means leading. And that's exactly what this government intends to do. Thank you very much. Merci.
Mandy Gull-Masty, Good afternoon. Thank you for coming. My name is Mandy Gull-Masty. I am the Minister of Indigenous Services for Government of Canada. Nishtem ge nui dan jibat mana jiwun tagnot machon nui wajemat njid wanjid ka wun hadan yo wayo ga shatsada. I want to also say that I acknowledge the loss of life that occurred, and I want to offer my prayers and condolences for those families that are grieving their loved ones this season. Bonjour, merci tout le monde de venir. Nous voyons maintenant une saison qui a commencé et des feux qui deviennent incontrôlables. Ça commence actuellement aussi dans une grande partie du Canada, en particulier les prairies. Tout aspect de la vie est touché par ces événements. Je tiens toujours d'abord à souligner l'impact profond des feux sur les familles, les individus, l'infrastructure, les communautés, à ceux qui ont perdu leur maison et qui ont été évacués et qui vivent présentement dans l'incertitude et qui ont peur. Je vous donne mes plus sincères condoléances. 2 provinces ont déclaré un état d'urgence en raison de feux de forêt. Au total, le feu rasant ou a rasé des terres qui sont à l'équivalent à presque 2 fois la superficie de l'île de Prince-Édouard, 3,7 millions d'hectares en tout. Le gouvernement du Canada, les gouvernements de toutes les provinces et tous les territoires, les gouvernements des nations autochtones, ainsi de plusieurs organisations et fournisseurs de services de gestion d'urgence ont été mobilisés dans cette période. La lutte contre les incendies est et resterait un défi de taille. La crise climatique pour tout le monde, nous voyons, est une réalité maintenant. Des feux de forêt catastrophiques sont partout dans le pays et les communautés et les Premières Nations sont exposées dans une façon disproportionnée à l'effet de ces événements extrêmes. En 2024, il y a eu 91 situations d'urgence dues à des feux de forêt et qui ont touché plusieurs communautés. Ici, aujourd'hui, nous voyons qu'il y a plus de 30 communautés autochtones qui ont été évacuées, avec un résultat de proche que 25 000 personnes sorties de leur communauté. Déjà aussi cette année, nous voyons plus que 50 Premières Nations ont été menacées par le feu de forêt. Plus de la moitié d'entre elles ont été évacuées et leurs membres ont été évacués avec leurs membres pour protéger leur vie. Certaines de ces évacuations ont été effectuées par l'aéronef militaire dans des communautés éloignées et isolées. Le programme d'aide de gestion des urgences de mon ministre fonctionne en plein régime pour financer les évacuations et soutenir les personnes évacuées. The Government of Canada supports all 4 pillars of emergency management, mitigation, preparedness, response, and recovery to assist First Nations in accessing proper and effective emergency management services with proper cultural supports for evacuees. The Emergency Management Assistance Program in my department reimburses First Nations as well as host communities, provinces, territories, and third-party emergency management providers 100% of eligible costs incurred during these evacuations. This can include things such as accommodations, meals, and essential items like baby formula. As of June 4 this year, more than $40.3 million has been provided through this program in advanced payments directly to support on-reserve and eligible communities impacted by these devastating wildfires. We are looking to ensure that we alleviate the immediate financial burden on First Nations and that we support them directly to ensure that on-reserve and eligible communities impacted by wildfires can meet the needs of their members. In addition, our department supports over 290 full-time or part-time emergency management coordinators in First Nations communities. I want to acknowledge their hard work and all of the situations that they have faced in these critical capacities. We also want to acknowledge that First Nations organizations and leadership are at the front line of this crisis situation and are supporting their members through the evacuation process. This is incredibly challenging work, and I want to acknowledge the leadership in those capacities. We know that First Nations organizations across the country have a very personal, deep connection to their land. We also know that they are carriers of invaluable Indigenous knowledge and have cultural methodologies that can help us contribute to disaster readiness and response. We must draw further on their unique knowledge and skill set to improve emergency preparedness and response. Climate change is a reality that we are now seeing, and we must work together to reflect their knowledge in resilience planning. In addition, Indigenous Services Canada's Emergency Management Fire Smart program also provides support for wildfire preparedness, including firefighter training, fuel management, and vegetation clearing to help mitigate further risk to Indigenous communities. We must work with communities to build and reinforce capacity on all fronts. Grâce à leur lien avec leur territoire, les communautés des Premières Nations contribuant avec la connaissance autochtone et des méthodes culturelles pour la prévention et l'intervention des cas de catastrophe. Nous devons nous inspirer pour améliorer la préparation et l'intervention en cas d'urgence. Nous travaillons avec les Premières Nations en rôle de partenariat égaux dans une approche globale pour la gestion des urgences. Nous sommes déterminés aussi à améliorer les services de gestion des urgences et de transférer aussi le contrôle des programmes de gestion d'urgence à nos partenaires des Premières Nations. Our department also collaborates in multilateral discussions with First Nations leadership, First Nations and provincial and territorial governments across Canada on the future emergency management service agreements that we want to bring in place. There has been significant progress, and we have been working towards developing multilateral emergency management agreements in various regions. These agreements can best ensure appropriate emergency management services are provided directly to First Nations communities and provides them also the self-determination in the decision-making process when they face these crisis situations. Je suis profondément reconnaissant à l'ensemble des premiers répondants, des travailleurs qui soutiennent le peuple autochtone et des personnes qui travaillent avec les communautés pour les protéger et protéger leur vie dans ces périodes de crise. Je voudrais aussi prendre un moment pour dire merci à toutes les personnes qui contribuent à ce processus, les communautés autochtones, mais aussi tout le monde qui aide dans le processus pour garder les personnes qui sont dans une situation d'évacuation dans une qualité de vie. Aussi, j'aimerais dire merci à tous les répondeurs qui ont participé à un processus de temps en temps avec une très courte période de réponse. I would also like to say that I am deeply grateful to first responders, support workers, First Nations leadership, and many people who are working behind the scenes, who are doing everything necessary to prevent the lives of those who are in the devastating paths of wildfires. It is important to also acknowledge that often the response that is required is requested in a very short period of time. Leaders across Canada are stepping up and are filling essential gaps so that our friends and families remain safe, comfortable, and hopeful during times of crisis. I've also been personally touched by the stories that have been shared with me through the members of the Indigenous caucus, as well as First Nations leaders who've reached out directly to me to speak of the stories that have happened at evacuation sites. I want to acknowledge the work of the Turtle team that is on site, operated by First Nations Health and Social Service Secretariat of Manitoba, who've been delivering culturally relevant care to those who need it most. Together, we are rebuilding a stronger tomorrow. Thank you, merci.
Hello, I'm Julie Dabrusin. Je suis la ministre de l'Environnement et Changement climatique. Et bonjour à tout le monde. Hello, everyone. And thanks for joining our press conference today. I'd like to join my colleagues to begin with by offering my deepest condolences to the families and the communities who've lost loved ones, and also to share that not just all of us up here, but all Canadians are thinking right now about all of the people who've been uprooted from their communities and who have seen their communities devastated by wildfires in this moment. And I'm also going to start by echoing what you've heard from my colleagues here, which is a deep gratefulness and thankfulness to all of the firefighters, the first responders, Canadian Armed Force members, and all of the volunteers out there who have really stepped up and shown so much courage and commitment and selflessness in this moment to keep people who are right now facing danger, to keep them safe. Canadians are feeling the impact of extreme weather events, including intense wildfire seasons year after year. And in fact, just last year, about 5 million hectares were burned by wildfires in Canada, which led to over $1 billion in economic loss. L'augmentation des températures et la sécheresse entraînent des feux de forêt plus fréquents et plus intenses partout au pays, alors que des températures supérieures à la normale ont été observées de façon constante à l'échelle nationale au cours de la dernière année. The federal government will be there to support communities across the country, and that starts with better anticipating, better managing, and better adapting to the risks created by weather-related emergencies, such as floods, tornadoes, hurricanes, blizzards, wildfires, and extreme heat. Bâtir des communautés résilientes, des infrastructures résilientes et une économie résiliente face aux inondations, aux feux, aux vagues de chaleur et aux tempêtes est essentiel pour permettre aux collectivités de se défendre contre les pires effets des changements climatiques. Year-round, Environment and Climate Change Canada generates seasonal weather outlooks and shorter-term predictions and forecasts. Our experts and teams are ready there to support Canadians as we are already in this wildfire season. We have an extensive network of weather stations, climate models, weather prediction systems, and experts monitoring the weather day and night to share accurate updates and ensuring Canadians have the information that they need to stay safe. Notre Centre canadien des services climatiques offre également un accès à des modèles et à des projections climatiques et nos équipes collaborent étroitement avec les autorités de santé, les organisations de gestion des urgences et les médias partout au pays. I'm fully committed to working with my colleagues, with the provinces, territories, Indigenous peoples to protect our communities, fight climate change, and keep Canadians safe. We're standing together. I hope you see that today with all of us here. The Canadians are all standing together, one for one, as we face into this wildfire season. Thank you. Merci.
Thank you, ministers. We will now turn to the room for questions. The opening statements were about half an hour, so we'll hope to be able to take at least that many questions. We'll start with Nick Murray from the Canadian Press.
Hi, ministers. Good afternoon. Thank you for taking our questions. I'll leave it to whichever minister wants to answer this. But on the heels of the 2023 wildfire season, one of the takeaways was the need for a national emergency response agency, Canada being one of the few G7 countries without one. So now as Canada is in the thick of the second worst wildfire season on record so far, where is the government at with creating such an agency?
I can tell you that the safety of Canadians is our first priority, and we will be looking at whether or not we'll be looking at any and all options to make sure that Canadians are safe during wildfire seasons, and that absolutely includes looking at whether or not we should put in place some sort of a national wildfire strategy. And we would need to discuss that. We would want to discuss that with our provincial and territorial counterparts as well. One of the things that we want to make sure is that we don't end up spending a lot of time and effort duplicating services that are already available and that already work very well. But that said, that is something that I and my department will be looking at and examining very closely in the future.
So with respect, we're 2 years past the worst wildfire record season in Canada, and we're still looking at potentially creating agency? I'm sorry, I'm just wondering if you can further clarify.
Well, we need to make sure that what we do is sensible and that we don't, as I said before, duplicate services that we already provide. And we need to make sure that we don't do things that are contrary to the things that are working very well at the present time. And just as an example, the Government Operations Center and its monitoring of wildfire events, CIFC, the Canadian Integrated Fire Center, these are organizations that work extremely well in terms of coordinating responses to wildfires and other events. As I said, though, that said, there is more that we can look at, and myself and my department will be doing that. Some of the things we could look at, for example, are whether or not we should be acquiring things like water bombers and other pieces of equipment on a national basis. And so we are committed to looking at things like that, procurement of equipment, and many other different aspects as well. And I had indicated in my remarks that I'll be meeting with my provincial and territorial counterparts in the weeks to come, and this will be part of an ongoing discussion. It has to involve all of the partners involved in emergency management. Thank you.
David Thurton, CBC News.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. The G7 Sherpa said this morning that leaders in Kananaskis would be issuing a short communique on collective action to fight wildfires. So I don't know which minister would answer this question, but what is Canada hoping to come out of those G7 talks when it comes to wildfires? What is Canada hoping to see in that communique?
I can tell you that one of the things that will be presented at the G7 is called the Kananaskis Wildfire Charter, and it's really Canada leading the stage through Prime Minister Carney with respect to taking steps to deal with all aspects of wildfires, including mitigation, preparedness, response, and recovery. And members of the G7 have already committed in principle to that wildfire charter. And there's not a doubt that wildfires affect us globally. And when we have a wildfire in one country, it affects the others in terms of smoke, for example. We also share equipment with other countries. We share ability to deal with wildfires with our international allies and friends. And so it's given that wildfires are global responsibility, given that they affect the other G7 nations equally, it's sensible for us to work with them and in coordination with them to develop an international agreement with respect to how wildfires are dealt with.
Thank you for that. And of course, what's making wildfires worse is climate change. So what are we going to be doing now that we're hosting the G7 this weekend, that the world does what it needs to do to keep 1.5 alive? Has climate change even on the agenda?
As far as me being the Minister of Environment and Climate Change, I can say that we're absolutely committed to continuing fighting climate change and to continue to drive down emissions. And there's a lot more work to do, but for the first time we see in Canada that our own emissions are going down and are decoupled from economic growth, which is a really big thing. So right now in this moment, our emissions are at the lowest they've been in almost 3 decades. And that's not discounting that there's a whole lot more work ahead of us, but there is something to show that we're on a progression in the right direction, and we need to keep working very much to fight climate change.
Natasha Bolowski, National Observer.
Hi, yeah, thank you for taking our questions and for the update. My question is about Bill C-5. I know that your government is hoping to get this through before the end of next week when the House rises. I mean, that just gives very little time to study it in committee, and it's obviously a very big bill affecting lots of different legislation. So, I mean, and also there's already been a lot of concerns raised by the AFN, other stakeholders, opposition parties. So for Mr. Hodgson or Ms. Dabrusin, I'm wondering, you know, given all those concerns, are you worried that committees are not going to be able to adequately study this massive bill?
Do you want me to? As the Prime Minister has said, we're in a very difficult situation right now. We have a trade war. We have a trade war that is affecting sector after sector after sector. Canadian jobs are at risk. Canadians' livelihoods are at risk, and quite frankly, the prosperity of the country is at risk. As the Prime Minister has said, we didn't ask for this trade war, but we need to deal with it. And to deal with it, as he has been very clear, we need to do things that we have not done in a long time, in time frames we have not done since the end of World War II. What we are doing is providing for debate. I spent 4 hours in the House last night in a committee of the whole. There is going to be the same sort of process in the Senate. It is important that we start moving, or we will find ourselves in an increasingly difficult situation from an economic perspective.
Thank you. And have you had any, well, not you, has anyone on your team had any conversations with Andrew Scheer and the Conservatives to, you know, gauge whether they would be willing to help you push this through? Where's that?
I don't think it's appropriate to talk about the private conversations that are going on. I think what you should take away from the First Minister's meeting in Saskatoon is there is broad Canadian consensus that getting on with retooling and reworking our economy in the face of this trade war is incredibly important, and there's broad support for that.
Fraser Needham, APTN.
Yeah, I'm just going to follow up on that Bill 5 question. I understand that we're in a trade war, and Canadians, there's a consensus among Canadians that we need to move forward on certain things. However, there's not much of a consensus on the way the government's approaching this from First Nations. I don't think we've heard from any First Nations that are actually in support of you ramming this bill through the legislature. So are you going to actually meet with them before you pass this legislation, or are you just going to, is it going to be business as usual and ram the bill through as you appear to be doing?
So there have been as soon as we started consulting with any other parties, we started consulting with various First Nations, both on the rights holder side, but also in the Indigenous business community. I think it's interesting to note that when we announced the bill, the First Nations Major Projects Coalition, which is a group that represents 108 First Nations that all have projects that they are interested in advancing, came out in support of the bill and thought it was a step in the right direction. As I have said, and I'll turn it over to my colleague, we are doing everything we can. We need to move with speed here. We're doing everything we can to consult. We've recognized in the legislation the charter rights of Indigenous people. We have talked about UNDRIP. We are setting up a advisory committee, a First Nations advisory committee to the Major Projects Office. I can tell you I've got multiple conversations going on with different rights holders and business leaders as part of my department's efforts to ensure that consultation is robust. And I'll give you just a little from my background in the former organizations that I was involved with. We built many projects with First Nations partnership, and what I found is when consultation works well, it doesn't slow projects down, it speeds projects up. And we saw that very clearly in my old role at Hydro One. So we're going to do everything we can to engage with First Nations, make sure they're part of this process, but we do need to move with speed. But I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you. I also want to acknowledge that the work that's been carried out on the One Canada Economy Bill is critical. It's not just critical for the Canadian economy, it is something that is also critical for Indigenous people. The reason why I'm saying that is because I believe that this bill is, I want to say, a new process in making sure that Indigenous economy is also reflected in the Canadian economy. And that is probably a reality that I don't think is well understood. First Nations have microeconomies. Sometimes they're directly linked to just the community. Sometimes they're internation. And I believe that this bill allows for a process to have discussion on how that level of community can be integrated into a larger scale project. I do want to acknowledge that, yes, there was a consultation process that was sent by letter to many First Nations partners, communities, leadership. Unfortunately, simultaneously, the wildfire season started, and I have heard through discussion in the ministries and at multiple tables the intention to be sure that the appropriate time and steps are taken to give community opportunity to be part of that dialogue in a meaningful way. And in reading the bill and having discussion, the acknowledgement of Section 35 is so profound, and it is not defined because of the intention to co-define that process with partnership. And I think that this is something that is unique to the One Canada Economy Bill, is that we're not just inviting Indigenous partnership to the table, we're actually asking them what is your process of consultation and how can we work with you in collaboration to carry out those steps? I also want to acknowledge that because there are many communities in a critical state of wildfire and evacuation, that time will be taken to have that dialogue. I know that it is the intention of the Prime Minister's office to sit down with First Nations leadership directly and to have that economic discussion and hear from them. Where is it that you want your nation to go in the future? How do you want to be a part of this process? And most importantly, how do you want to involve your community in that decision-making process? And I think that's the critical part of the bill, is to ensure that you are respecting what Section 35 says, what UNDRIP says, but you're having that meaningful dialogue right at the beginning, sitting down face to face. And I feel that the Prime Minister's approach of being the point of contact, having that conversation, that really sends a strong signal that it is partnership between First Nations leadership and the Government of Canada.
Yeah, just as a follow-up to that, I know that normally the process for bills is that they go first and second reading, and then they're given to committee which is an important part of our process in our Parliament, to make amendments, to make suggestions, to have groups intervene that may not have had the process to, including First Nations, in the normal passage of a bill. This bill gives a lot of power to the Prime Minister's office to basically bypass environmental regulations, things that are fairly important. So I'm just wondering, is there any chance that the government will take a step back and perhaps maybe look at expanding consultation on there aren't any committees right now that have been struck. Leave this to the fall and leave some time for more feedback and seeing the summer. I mean, you'll be back in the House in the fall, that you could have some serious discussion on this bill, which has not happened, and maybe move to pass it sometime in the fall.
I think the Prime Minister has been clear. We are in a trade war. We need to move as quickly as possible. Canadians are losing their jobs today. We continue to see unjust tariffs put on different sectors over and over again. One of the key things about this bill is it will get projects moving. It will give us the opportunity to create employment for people who are now facing challenges. It will stimulate development in our economy as this trade war is hurting us across sector. And so we'll do everything we can from a consultation perspective, but the Prime Minister's been clear we need to move quickly given the unjust trade war that we're in right now.
I'd also like to add on that the bill does take a new approach to project development. It also does establish the creation of two critical points of contact, which is having the new office that will be in place to manage the process, which is a one-window approach. Companies would come in, organizations would come in, partnerships would come in with one point of contact, and the minister that is in charge of that process will interface with multiple ministries. It is to create more efficiency, it is to create effectiveness in the decision-making process, and it does not do away with impact assessment. It allows for better mechanisms in place to be responsive to the questions that are being asked. And it also provides the opportunity for Indigenous people to be a part of that assessment process. And I think that Indigenous peoples have enough traditional and hereditary knowledge of their territories that they are probably the strongest voice for concern or defense of protecting an area. And the Prime Minister has been clear. These projects will be selected if the communities wish to participate. So I think there are multiple points where if First Nations or other groups feel that they want to bring forward their concerns, that those mechanisms, albeit new, a new process, will still be in place.
Catherine,
I could just add a comment as well. It's my understanding that once a project becomes a national project, there's another opportunity for consultation on a project-by-project basis. So there's the initial round of consultations with respect to whether or not a project meets the criteria. And then there's an opportunity for another set of consultations for a particular project. So, I just did want to make that clear that there are two opportunities.
Catherine Levesque, National Post.
Thank you, Mia. Sorry, just continuing on C5 for Minister Hodgson. I understand the Prime Minister has said it can't wait, it has to pass as soon as possible, but realistically, what would be the effect of waiting 3 or 4 months for C5 to pass? What would happen in the grand scheme of things?
You should ask that to all the auto workers who are losing their jobs, to all the aluminum workers who are losing their jobs, to all the steel workers who are losing their jobs, to all the forestry products people in small towns across the country who are losing their jobs. Every day, our economy is being attacked. Every day we are losing jobs. We need to fight for those people. We need to move.
I also want to just say today's conversation is really about the wildfires. I know that we've answered a few questions on that important subject, but I want to really stress that there are people living in a crisis situation, over 25,000 people who are affected, First Nations and non-Indigenous, and I would really like to be able to provide information on those subjects today.
Absolutely, but we're the ones asking the questions, and respectfully, you've spoken for 30 minutes on this subject, which is extremely important, I will assure you. But I also had another question just on nuclear, also an important subject. The Atomic Energy of Canada just announced this morning that the Canadian nuclear laboratories would be managed by a new entity as of September. It's called Nuclear Laboratories Partners of Canada, but it's pretty much Canadian in name only. All of the partners are either based in the U.S. or owned by U.S. companies. So I just was wondering, Minister Hodgson, if the government is comfortable with our nuclear laboratories being managed by an American-owned venture, and if you had any power about that.
So the process to select the entity that will oversee the management of these various facilities was an independent process run by AECL. The consortium that was picked to do that, it's an $800 million contract that will last for about 6 years. It covers 4,000 employees. The management of those 4,000 employees, every one of those employees is in Canada. 95% of the money that is spent will be spent in Canada. Canada welcomes companies from all jurisdictions to come here and work. This is money that will be spent in Canada with overseeing Canadian jobs at Canadian facilities.
Okay, we will move online for questions. At the moment, I see one hand raised, but if you are online and want to ask a question, please use the raised hand function. We'll go to Laura Osman from The Logic.
Hi, Ministers. Thanks for taking our questions. My question is also about Bill C5 for Minister Hodgson. I just was hoping you could perhaps unpack how a pipeline may qualify for this sort of nation-building status, given that there are no current proponents. Is there a path for a pipeline to be among some of these first projects that will be announced?
So what was agreed in Saskatoon between the Prime Minister and the 13 premiers what is a set of criteria for projects of national interest. There are 5 criteria. I won't necessarily go through them in this answer, but they're clearly laid out in the press release and in the bill itself. What was agreed was any projects that come forward will be assessed against that criteria. For a project to come forward, it is going to need to, as I call it, bubble up from consultations between federal and provincial governments, governments, Indigenous peoples, because they'll often infect Indigenous communities, and proponents. We will not be evaluating hypothetical projects. We will be evaluating real projects with real proponents. I will highlight the third criteria was a high probability of success. I think it's pretty clear to say that for a project to be successful, it is going to need a private sector proponent who is interested in putting the money to work.
Thank you. You know, I think some folks who were in the pipeline building business, at least what we've heard from politicians in the West, is that they haven't been looking at projects because the regulatory environment has been unfriendly in their view. And so they don't have the head start perhaps that some other proponents may have with relation to other projects. Is there any provision for getting pipelines built that may take that into account, given that building pipelines hasn't been top of mind for them recently because of the very issues you're trying to address with this bill?
We've had consultations with many different private sector potential proponents. What they tell us is they really like the bill. They like the certainty that it creates. The idea that a project gets evaluated against these 5 criteria. If it is designated as a project of national interest, there is then a conditions document put against it where all the conditions to operate are laid out publicly and transparently. And the government will commit to do its part in getting through those conditions within 2 years or less. That gives clarity about a process. That gives certainty about timelines. If you are a allocator of capital, as I was in my former life, that certainty is what gets people interested in projects. And that's what we're trying to deliver, more clarity in the timelines. We need to do everything we've done in the past, but we need to do it as well or better, but we need to do it faster.
Nelly Gudici, Media Tanois.
Hello, do you hear me well?
Yes, go ahead.
Thank you. So it was said the West and the North is at risk for this fire season. So I would like to know what has been done so far with the Yukon and Northwest government and the Yukon and Northwest Indigenous government to make sure the emergency response will be effective and successful in case of an evacuation over the summer.
Okay, thank you. I just want to acknowledge that this is really a critical time in Canada. There are people that are in an emergency situation, sometimes having to leave their homes with very little, suddenly, late in the evening, early in the morning, children that are, leaving their beds, sometimes leaving with or without their pets, families that are, trying to make sure that they're meeting up in a coordination point of evacuation. There are so many challenges, and just giving the time and respect to what people are going through is really, for me as a minister, my first criteria in how we respond to people. I went through a period of being a leader during the last fire season, which was devastating to my nation. And I want to acknowledge those people that are really just in a space of uncertainty and how traumatizing that can be and how hard that can be for families, for mental health, and for trying to respond to that situation. And I want to be clear that it is the intention of my ministry, as well as other ministries, to really respond to that. That's really important and critical. In terms of looking at the places that are not in a state of emergency or provinces that haven't declared a state of emergency, I have already been having active dialogue with Indigenous groups, with leadership from those places. So we have been reaching out to Alberta. We've been even reaching out to leadership in Saskatchewan. I had a meeting with the Northwest Territories last week. we were able to have dialogue on these issues, although they are not in a state of emergency. We are also having, this preemptive discussion to prepare if it comes to that situation. And I think that's the important part of relationship when you're trying to respond to humans that are in a state of crisis and their lives are impacted by wildfire. So for us, within my department, really being sure that we are capturing that approach when we're talking to people, to remember that yes, there's jurisdiction, there's bureaucracy in the process, but at the end of the day, we are dealing with people and we want to respond to their needs and their well-being, and to be sure that they're able to get through this first part of the crisis, which is evacuation, and to help them through the next parts of it, which is returning home and dealing with the after effects in their community that forest fire leaves behind, and what we will see in the future, because we know that impact of forest fire is not just a one-phase occurrence. There are also additional components, and we will see in the future that impact in place. So resilience is a key part of that, but also having a longer discussion on how we will deal with those lasting impacts and the harms that it is creating for people. That's really an essential part of that. We are dealing with the lives of Canadians, Indigenous and non-Indigenous, and it's important for us as a government to keep that in mind, keep that at the forefront when we are taking action to respond.
I would just maybe add to that these evacuations were incredibly challenging, particularly in Manitoba, because they involved evacuating people from remote areas. And that was a difficulty in and of itself. And then those evacuees moved to a place of safety, but then needed to be evacuated even further. So move from the place of safety somewhere else to be accommodated. And just with respect to that process, it was incredibly challenging for cities like Winnipeg that were receiving evacuees, because they didn't receive them in one way. They received some coming by, car, and some coming by plane. And they were coming to various different locations. And so just the effort that's required to deal with this evacuation, I would just add, from an air evacuation point of view, I don't think we've seen an evacuation of as many thousands of people as were safely evacuated so far. So again, just to stress that these are very, very challenging times, and to commend the work of all of the people on the ground who made sure that people were evacuated to safe places and were kept safe.
Nellie, did you have a follow-up question?
No, I don't have any follow-up questions. Thank you so much for your response.
Okay, that's all the time we have for questions today. I'd like to thank the ministers for joining us, and everyone have a great afternoon.